Today I'm going to take you on a journey back in time to 2005. Weezer's Beverly Hills was on the radio, Resident Evil 4 was revolutionizing the survival horror genre, and people were filling up theaters to watch Diary of a Mad Black Woman. At the same time, a notorious photo had begun making its rounds on the internet. Meet Brian Peppers. In early 2005, Brian Peppers had begun making his way into people's inboxes, people's MySpace comments, and perhaps, most importantly for this story, YTMND, aka
You're the man now, dog.
March 26 marks the first appearance of Brian Peppers on YTMND. This first Brian Peppers YTMND, created by Shadow22, features the classic Brian Peppers picture, the song Requiem for a Tower, which you probably remember from basically every movie trailer around that time, and the caption, "You gon' get raped," which was a reference to a popular image macro that had been floating around for years prior. At this point, the Brian Peppers meme, or fad as we called it back then on YTMND, had yet to reach its final form. And very little was actually known about Brian Peppers at this time. In fact, Brian's appearance was so unusual that a lot of people thought it was photoshopped. The website Snopes, which at the time primarily focused on debunking urban legends and internet rumors, was on the case. It turned out that the picture had originated from an Ohio sex offenders registry, lending some credence to the original caption. However, it was still possible that the picture was photoshopped and the entry was a false one. They had to rule out the potential that there was anybody at the office messing around with the website. So Snopes called up the Ohio Attorney General's office to ask about Brian Peppers, and this was their response. This is an accurate photo of this offender. Snopes also managed to acquire a few Brian Peppers yearbook pictures from people who grew up with him.
What would we do, baby, without us?
So we had confirmation, Brian Peppers was a real person. He wasn't photoshopped, he was just suffering from some kind of condition, potentially Cruzon syndrome or Apert syndrome. And he was also a bona fide sex offender on the registry for what they called gross sexual imposition. That's a charge that sounds like it means you had a sexual encounter that made you late for a business meeting or something like that, but what it actually refers to is groping. I like how I put my hands to the camera when I said groping. And the news of his criminal status would lead the Brian Peppers meme, or excuse me, the Brian Peppers YTMND fad, to evolve into its true form. On April 5th of 2005, a YTMND user named LoveMoz would create a site that wound up establishing the defining characteristics of Brian Peppers memes. LoveMoz's YTMND showed Brian Peppers hiding in a mailbox, stalking a woman on a park bench. The caption says, "Brian No," which is the caption that would be repeated on a lot of these sites, and the song associated with it was Burn Babonga from Chrono Trigger. To this day, that is the song that would be associated with Brian Peppers. If anybody posts that song anywhere, it's very likely that there will be people referencing Brian Peppers in the comments. LoveMoz's YTMND would inspire a ton of other users to create their own sites featuring the caption Brian No, Brian hiding somewhere, and the song Burn Babonga. At this point, the Brian Peppers fad was quickly consuming all of YTMND. And this meme was going strong until an observant YTMND user named Grimaf made another site urging people to cool it with their memeing. His appeal fittingly featured a different JRPG song, Forever Rachel from Final Fantasy VI. The truth about Brian Peppers. 1. He is wheelchair bound. The handle for his wheelchair is visible in the photo for his registration. His mugshots are further proof of this, and you can clearly see the wheelchair. He lives in a nursing home. And they share the link of the address on his sex offender registry, and sure enough it turns out that the address is a nursing home. 3. His charges of gross sexual imposition were the result of groping a nurse. And there's a record of his charges. So please, leave Brian alone. He's had a rough life as it is. You've had your laughs. And now that's all well and good, but I'm not too sure about that third point. I mean, it seems like he's implying that, oh, it's because he groped a nurse, it's not that big of a deal. And there were some people in the comments who kind of noticed that same thing. So, how does the fact that Peppers groped a nurse justify leaving him alone? You're a total Fiv King moron, dude. Cause nurses want to be groped. In fact, all girls want to be groped. Heck, they wouldn't be out in public if they didn't want some. But grimaf's YTMND was far from the end of the story. Very shortly after, someone came forward claiming to be Brian Peppers' brother, Alan. My name is Alan Peppers, and I am a relative of Brian. I have been inspired by grimaf's creation and have decided to present the whole story as a means to clear up any debate and hopefully to quell the raging negative enthusiasm about Brian. As you may know, Brian suffers from Apert syndrome, a condition which, among other things, causes the plates in his skull to fuse together in an irregular fashion. I believe that his appearance had much to do with the reaction to his alleged crime. Brian is absolutely not a pedophile. He was given 5 years probation for allegedly groping his nurse. Brian is a paraplegic who spends his life in nursing homes. He is not mentally retarded and is in fact quite intelligent. I play chess with him every week. Grimaf was correct to spot that Brian uses a wheelchair. He is only capable of slow, painful walking and tends to hobble on the sides of his feet. But this is not due to a birth defect. Brian suffers from congestive heart failure due to his abuse of alcohol. Subsequently, blood clots have formed in his extremities, making it nearly impossible to perform any task that requires even the smallest amount of dexterity. He has marginal use of his hands, enough to eat, play chess, read books, etc. The photograph of him, which many of you so famously parade around the internet, was taken at the Ohio Registrar's office at 7:30 in the morning. Brian cannot groom himself properly. The repetitive motions of combing his hair, brushing his teeth, and shaving are simply too much for him. These are tasks that I must perform for him, and thus we see a man who is disheveled and crude looking, drawing even further accusations. Brian's appearance has been his downfall. The nurse who filed suit against him was acting out of fear. Brian told me, and I truly believe him, that he was merely trying to get her attention. He grabbed and tore the back of her skirt. She fled and called the police. Brian is lacking in some fundamental social skills, but that comes from a life of being teased and tormented, not from any mental condition. Prior to his accusation, Brian was a model citizen. He held a steady job as a librarian's assistant and even helped me raise my own children. But since his appearance in court, his health has declined rapidly. He is very sick, but thankfully no longer uses alcohol. Brian is the epitome of the misunderstood outlaw, a true-to-life Quasimodo of sorts, whose only desire is to be treated with the respect he deserves. Brian is a human being. Please, please leave my brother alone. Sincerely, Alan Peppers. And although a lot of people in the YTMND community were moved by this story, there are also a lot that had their doubts. I mean, this is just a guy who shows up and claims to be Brian Peppers' brother with no evidence of any sort, and he somehow magically just instantly knows how to use YTMND. That doesn't seem too likely. But he gave so many details that a lot of people just really decided to give him the benefit of the doubt. And after this YTMND got really popular, Alan Peppers went ahead and made another site. Well, everyone has had their fun at Brian's and my expense. Many of you have spent time trying to prove me wrong. I have received more emails and phone messages to last a lifetime, and a wave of doubt is now sweeping across the internet. Truthfully, that is hardly my concern. It was never my intention to convince anyone of my relationship with Brian, merely to inform people of his innocence. But none of that matters now. At 4:59 a.m. this morning, Brian Peppers left this world for good. I loved him more than words could say. Godspeed, big brother. You know, a really touching story, really sad. And you know, what are the odds that Alan Peppers would come forward with the truth about Brian and then just like that, he dies? Well, there's one more panel to this YTMND. By the way, he left in a time machine, lol. Yep, it was all bullshit. There was no Alan Peppers who knew Brian Peppers, who was related to Brian Peppers. Just made the whole thing up. For all anybody knew, Brian Peppers was still very much alive and well. And Brian Peppers would continue to be a meme that would persist and evolve for many years. But sadly, in 2012, Brian Peppers would actually pass away. This is evidenced by his memorial page. Brian Peppers is survived by his memes, his fan art, and fan pages such as "We love sex offender Brian Peppers." And thus we come to the end of the Brian Peppers story. And if you enjoyed this video looking way too deeply into an old meme, you'll enjoy this one too. I'm out of here.